The morning was unusually bright for a weekday in the small town. Sunlight spilled through the tall courthouse windows, lighting up the polished wooden benches and the quiet corridors. Most people passing through the halls were serious and busy lawyers with stacks of papers, clerks moving quickly from one office to another, and a few visitors who seemed lost, peering around as if the building itself was a maze. Among them, one teenager walked nervously, clutching a worn notebook and a small folder stuffed with papers. She had never imagined she would be walking into a courtroom like this. Facing a judge and explaining herself, she wasn't a troublemaker. In fact, she had always been the kind of person who stayed out of problems. She loved reading, helping at the local community center, and spending time with her younger sibling. But life has a way of surprising you, and today, she was caught in a situation that seemed unfair, confusing, and scary all at once. The charge was minor in some ways, almost laughable, but to her it mattered deeply. It wasn't just about the rule or law. It was about her dignity, her reputation, and proving that she was telling the truth. As she entered the courtroom, the judge's bench loomed above. The judge was a man known for his strictness, his reputation as someone who rarely tolerated nonsense. He looked at her with a faint smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes, almost as if he was already certain how this little case would go. The prosecutor, a confident, well-dressed professional, was already seated, flipping through a thick file with a practiced air. On the other side, the defense attorney for the case seemed indifferent. Occasionally, glancing at the teenager with a hint of skepticism, she took a deep breath and walked up to the front, her heart racing. The room seemed larger than she remembered from the time she had visited with her family for unrelated matters. The wood smelled faintly of polish, and the quiet ticking of the clock echoed around the room. Everyone's eyes were on her. Some curious, some judgmental, and some just indifferent. "I understand you are representing yourself today?" the judge asked, a note of surprise in his voice. He leaned back slightly, a half-smile playing on his lips. It wasn't an encouraging smile. It was the kind that suggested he was already imagining how amusing this would be. "Very well. Let's hear what you have to say." Her palms were sweating. She had prepared, of course. For days, she had gone over every detail, every document, every small piece of evidence that could help her tell her story. She had practiced speaking calmly, clearly, and politely, knowing that any sign of panic or anger could be used against her. But hearing the judge's faint chuckle as he addressed her made her nervous. She swallowed, forcing herself to focus. I just want to explain what happened," she began, her voice steady, despite the fluttering in her chest. "I know this might sound unusual, but I have all the details here, and I hope you will allow me to show the truth of the situation." The judge raised an eyebrow and let out a short laugh. "Child, I appreciate your courage, but this seems more like a misunderstanding than anything else. Surely your parents could have handled this for you. But go ahead. I'm listening." The laughter hit harder than she expected. It wasn't mean-spirited, not exactly, but it carried the weight of underestimation. Everyone in the courtroom seemed to feel it, to the prosecutor's smirk, the murmurs of amusement from the gallery. She noticed it all, but instead of letting it shake her, she reminded herself why she was here. Her mind flashed back to the moment that had started this whole situation. It had seemed so simple at first. She had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, or maybe the right place at the wrong moment. Whatever the case, a misunderstanding had spiraled into a formal charge. She had explained it to her parents, to the school, and even to friends, but no one had taken it seriously until the official letter arrived. Reading it had made her stomach drop. She wasn't guilty of anything intentional, yet here she was. Facing a courtroom and a judge who already seemed amused by the idea of her defense, she opened her folder and took out a neatly organized set of papers. Each one was labeled carefully with dates, times, and explanations. There were even photos and receipts, all small but meaningful pieces of evidence. She had spent hours compiling them, making sure each piece supported her story. As she laid them out in front of her, she felt a small surge of confidence. This wasn't just her voice speaking. These papers, these facts were standing with her. "I know this might seem minor," she continued, looking the judge in the eyes, "but it's important to me that the truth is heard. I've documented everything carefully, and I hope you'll allow me to present it." The judge leaned back, still with that faint smirk. "Child, you're brave to stand here, but let's see if your facts match reality." There was a pause. The prosecutor glanced at her papers and then back at the judge, clearly expecting this to be a short, uneventful case. The gallery seemed to relax a little, some assuming this would be an easy win for the other side. But the teenager didn't let their doubt discourage her. She began telling the story step by step, starting from the very beginning. She spoke about the day it all started, describing the small actions, the sequence of events, and the misunderstandings that had led to this moment. She explained where she had been, what she had seen, and what she had done. She didn't exaggerate, she didn't plead dramatically, she just told the truth, plain and simple. Her voice was steady, calm, and deliberate, carrying a quiet determination that was hard to ignore. As she spoke, she noticed some heads turning slightly, people leaning in to listen more closely. The judge's smirk hadn't disappeared entirely, but his eyes were now studying her with genuine curiosity. Even the prosecutor seemed to be paying closer attention, flipping through the documents she had provided. There was something about the way she had prepared, the way she spoke with honesty and clarity, that made people pause and rethink their assumptions. It wasn't just about the papers or the evidence. It was the way she carried herself. Despite being underestimated, despite the laughter and doubt, she remained respectful and confident. She didn't argue with anyone unnecessarily, she didn't raise her voice, and she didn't show fear. That quiet strength made the courtroom feel a little different. It wasn't tense or hostile, it was a space where the truth was starting to take center stage, slowly pushing aside the assumptions that had dominated the room. Moments before, the teenager finished her first part of the explanation and looked up at the judge. "That's why I believe this charge is not accurate," she said softly. "I hope this helps everyone understand what really happened." There was silence for a moment. The judge tapped his fingers on the desk and then, unexpectedly, let out a soft chuckle again. This time it wasn't mocking, it was almost contemplative, like he was realizing he might have judged too quickly. The prosecutor exchanged a glance with an assistant, both of them now more attentive than before. Even the spectators leaned in, curious to see what would happen next. She felt a small wave of relief, but didn't let herself relax completely. She knew this was only the beginning. Her story had been heard, but it wasn't yet fully believed. She still had to show that the evidence supported every claim she had made. The next steps would require patience, careful explanation, and perhaps a little strategy. But for the first time, she felt a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, things could turn in her favor. Walking back to her seat, she kept her eyes forward. Her mind was already planning the next part of her explanation, how she would present the documents and how she would answer the questions that were likely coming. She could feel the courtroom's energy shifting, slowly, from amusement to attention. And that thought gave her courage. No one could have predicted that a quiet, nervous teenager walking into the courthouse that morning would end up commanding the room with the simple power of truth and preparation. But here she was, standing at the edge of what could become a surprising turn of events, one that would soon make the judge and everyone else see her in a completely different light. The courtroom was quieter now. The judge, who had once chuckled at the teenager's defense, was no longer smiling. The prosecutor, too, was no longer as confident as before. He leaned back in his chair, flipping through the evidence provided by the teenager with a new sense of purpose. It was clear that the case was no longer as simple as they had once thought. The teenager's calm, respectful demeanor, combined with the well-organized evidence she had presented, was slowly shifting the balance in her favor. Sitting in the chair, she tried to steady her breath. Her heart was still racing. It wasn't just the pressure of the situation, but also the way the atmosphere in the room had changed. She could feel the eyes on her, the intensity of the judge's gaze, and the expectant silence that hung in the air. She had made a good first impression with her initial explanation, but now it was time to back up her words with more solid evidence. She looked at the judge, then at the prosecutor, and then back to the small pile of papers in front of her. It was all she had, but she had made sure that each document was a piece of the puzzle. She wasn't going to leave anything to chance. She couldn't afford to. "I'd like to present my next piece of evidence," she said, her voice calm. Though she could feel the nervousness in her hands as she reached for another document in the folder, the judge nodded, his expression serious now. "Proceed," he said, motioning for her to continue. The teenager laid out the next piece of evidence, a receipt. It was from a local store, dated the same day she had been accused of the alleged incident. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow as he glanced at it. "This receipt," she began, "proves that I was not at the location where the incident occurred at the time it was supposed to have happened. I was at this store, as you can see from the timestamp, and I even have a video of me at the counter making a purchase." She paused for a moment, watching the prosecutor's reaction. For a second, the room was still. The judge peered over the top of his glasses, examining the receipt carefully. The prosecutor's eyes narrowed, but he didn't interrupt her. She was saying things that weren't easily dismissed, and that worried him. "I'm sure you'll agree that this receipt and the video provide a clear timeline of where I was," she continued. "I wasn't at the scene of the incident." The prosecutor shifted in his chair, not looking so sure anymore. He glanced down at the documents in front of him, clearly reconsidering the case. The teenager's eyes flicked over to him, catching the slight change in his posture. He wasn't as confident as before. That gave her hope. She had prepared for this moment. She knew that the prosecutor would try to poke holes in her defense, to find any flaw in her evidence, and to dismiss her story. But she wasn't about to let that happen. She had thought of everything. Next, she presented the timestamp on a series of texts from her phone. These were texts she had sent to her best friend earlier in the day, right around the time the incident was supposed to have happened. She had exchanged messages about a book they were reading, making plans to meet later in the week. She had even sent a picture of the store she had been in, showing the bookshelves in the background. "These texts," she explained, "show that I was in the store at the time. I wasn't even close to the location where this incident occurred, and I have the photos and timestamps to prove it." She could feel the tension in the room rise. The prosecutor, now thoroughly intrigued, skimmed through the texts on her phone, his expression turning more serious. He was quiet for a moment, then glanced at the judge, as if seeking permission to speak. The judge didn't say anything at first, just studied the evidence thoughtfully. Finally, he looked at the prosecutor. "Do you have any further questions for the defendant?" The judge asked, his tone sharp. The prosecutor hesitated for a moment before answering. "No, Your Honor, I'll admit, this new evidence changes the timeline significantly. I'll need to review it with my team." He looked at the teenager, his voice softer than before. "You've made a very good case." The teenager didn't smile, though she wanted to. Instead, she nodded, keeping her focus on the judge. This wasn't the time to get overconfident. There was still a long way to go before this case would be resolved. The judge glanced at both the prosecutor and the teenager, then leaned forward, his fingers steepled together in front of him. "It's clear that there is more to this situation than I initially believed," he said, his voice steady. "But there is still one important question we need to address. Why wasn't this information presented earlier?" The teenager took a deep breath. She had expected this question. She had rehearsed her answer in her head, knowing it might come up. "I didn't know that my defense would be taken seriously," she said honestly. "When I first received the letter about the charge, I was scared. I didn't think anyone would believe me, so I kept my evidence to myself, thinking it wouldn't matter. But when I saw how people were treating me, I realized I had to stand up for myself." The judge didn't interrupt, but his expression softened slightly. He looked at the prosecutor, who was now silently nodding. Acknowledging the teenager's courage, the prosecutor cleared his throat. "I understand, but I still have to review this evidence further." The judge turned his gaze back to the teenager. "You've presented a compelling case," he said. "I'm going to give both sides some time to review everything. We will reconvene in 30 minutes to continue. Until then, please remain in the courtroom." The teenager nodded, trying to steady her racing heart. She had done all she could for now. The judge had acknowledged her efforts, and the prosecutor had admitted that her evidence had changed the course of the case. That was a victory in itself. As she sat back down, the tension in the room seemed to lift, though only slightly. People were still watching her, but the atmosphere had shifted. There was no more mocking or dismissive laughter. Everyone was focused now, taking her seriously, and that was all she had wanted: to be heard, to be understood. She glanced at the prosecutor, who was quietly discussing the evidence with his assistant. For the first time, he wasn't looking at her with skepticism. Instead, he was looking at the documents she had presented, trying to make sense of the timeline she had laid out. She didn't expect him to change his mind entirely, but the fact that he was taking her seriously made her feel like she had a real chance to win this. The judge's words rang in her ears as she sat back, waiting for the break to end. Compelling case? It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. And that felt good. As she sat there, surrounded by the quiet hum of the courtroom, she realized something important. She had done this on her own. It had been her decision to stand up for herself, her courage to present the truth. It was easy to feel powerless in situations like this, especially when everyone around you is quick to judge. But today, in that courtroom, she had taken control of her story. And that was something no one could take away from her. She wasn't sure how this would all end. But one thing was certain: she wasn't backing down now. The break lasted what felt like an eternity. The teenager sat quietly in her seat, her hands folded in her lap, trying not to let her mind race too far ahead. Outside the courtroom, the buzz of the hallway made her feel a little more alone. There were murmurs, low voices, and the shuffle of shoes on the cold marble floor. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. This was the moment that would determine everything, the moment that could turn everything. She had worked for into a win or a loss. Her thoughts kept drifting back to what the judge had said before the break. He had called her case compelling. That was huge. It was a small victory, but it meant something. It meant the judge was considering her side seriously. The prosecutor, too, had admitted that her evidence was changing the direction of the case. But none of that meant she could relax. It only meant she had gotten this far. She had to keep going. She had to finish strong. She glanced over at the other side of the courtroom. The prosecutor was sitting at his desk, talking with his assistant in low tones. They were both flipping through the papers she had presented earlier, the ones with timestamps and receipts, the ones that proved her innocence. The teenager watched them closely, trying to gauge their reactions. She noticed the way the prosecutor occasionally paused, as if something in the documents had made him stop and think. That made her feel a little more confident. Maybe, just maybe, she was getting through to him across from her. The defense attorney sat with a neutral expression, though he glanced at her with a mix of respect and disbelief. He had never expected the teenager to present such a well-organized defense. He had thought this case would be a walk in the park, an easy win for the other side. But now it was anything but easy. He had underestimated her, and it was clear he was rethinking his own role in this case. The teenager didn't have time to focus on him for long. Her mind was still running through the evidence she had presented, thinking about what might be coming next. She knew she couldn't let up. She had worked too hard for this. This wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about showing that she had the right to stand up for herself. That she wasn't just going to be dismissed because she was young or because people assumed she didn't know what she was talking about. Her eyes wandered back to the judge's bench. He was sitting there, his hands folded, looking over the case file as if he were deep in thought. She couldn't read his expression. It wasn't friendly, but it wasn't cold either. He was just thinking. She couldn't tell if he was impressed by her evidence or if he was still skeptical about her story. Either way, she couldn't waste any time worrying about what he thought. She had to stick to the facts. Finally, the sound of the door opening broke her thoughts. The judge had returned. The prosecutor followed him in, his assistant trailing behind. Everyone took their seats, and the room fell into a heavy silence. The teenager felt her heart skip a beat. This was it. This was the moment when everything would either fall apart or come together. The judge cleared his throat and looked over at her. "We're ready to continue," he said, his voice steady. "The court has reviewed all of the evidence presented so far, and I believe it's time to proceed with the next step." The teenager sat up straighter. She had prepared for this moment, had thought about every possible outcome. But now, with the judge's words hanging in the air, she was starting to feel the pressure of the situation again. The last thing she wanted was to make a mistake at this point. She had come so far, and she couldn't afford to lose focus now. The prosecutor stood up. His expression was less confident than before, but he still had a job to do. He looked at the judge, then at the teenager. Your Honor, with all due respect, I believe we need to review the timeline of events one more time. The evidence presented doesn't entirely clear the defendant. There are still some unanswered questions regarding the context of the incident. The teenager felt a twinge of worry. She had known this might happen. The prosecutor wasn't going to let her get away without a fight. But she had already prepared for this. She had thought about every possible argument he could make, and she had answers for them. The judge nodded slowly. Go ahead, he said. Motioning for the prosecutor to continue, the prosecutor turned back to her and started going over the timeline of the incident. He was methodical, presenting details that seemed to poke at the gaps in her story. He pointed out moments where her evidence didn't align perfectly with the supposed timeline of the event. He questioned the reliability of some of her sources and even suggested that her compelling evidence might have been manipulated or misinterpreted. The teenager listened closely, taking mental notes as he spoke. She didn't interrupt. She knew that if she interrupted now, it would only make her look defensive. So she sat still, focused on what he was saying, and waited for the right moment to respond. Finally, the prosecutor stopped talking. He looked at her with a challenging expression. So, as you can see, there are still inconsistencies in your defense. It's possible you didn't intend to do anything wrong, but the evidence doesn't fully support your version of events. For a moment, the teenager felt a pang of doubt. Was he right? Had she missed something? She quickly shook it off. She couldn't let herself doubt now. She had worked too hard, come too far to let a few doubts make her falter. She took a deep breath and stood up, her eyes locking with the prosecutor's. She wasn't going to back down. Not now, not when everything she had worked for was on the line, Your Honor, she began, her voice steady and clear. I understand that the prosecutor is trying to point out inconsistencies. But let me clarify a few things. She paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts. She could feel the judge's eyes on her, the prosecutor's too. This was her moment. The reason there may appear to be gaps in the timeline is because of the way the incident was reported. She continued. The event wasn't an isolated moment. It took place over a series of actions, and some of those actions weren't recorded as clearly as they should have been. But I have shown you everything I could to prove that I wasn't at the scene at the time it happened. She pointed to the documents in front of her. The receipts, the text messages, the video. All of it supports my story. The prosecutor opened his mouth to respond, but the judge raised his hand, signaling for him to wait. I think the defendant has made her case, the judge said. We've heard both sides. Now I'll make my decision. The room fell silent again. The teenager's heart was pounding in her chest, but she kept her breathing steady. She couldn't afford to show any weakness now. The judge looked at the prosecutor. I will take your concerns into account, but I have seen no evidence that disproves the defendant's claims. He paused, then turned to the teenager. You've provided enough evidence to raise serious questions about this charge. I'm ruling in your favor. The case is dismissed. The words hung in the air for a long moment. The teenager couldn't quite process what she had just heard. She was free. She had won. Her hands shook as she gathered her things, but she didn't let herself smile just yet. She stood up, slowly, trying to keep her composure. The room seemed to be spinning around her, but she took a deep breath. Steadying herself as she walked out of the courtroom, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. The case had been dismissed, and with it all the weight that had been pressing down on her for weeks. It was over. She had done it. Against all odds, she had stood her ground and she had won. And for the first time in a long time, she felt truly proud of herself. The courtroom was still and silent as the judge made his ruling. The teenager stood motionless, not quite sure she had heard him right. Her mind raced as she processed his words. The case is dismissed? For a moment, it felt like the entire room had gone quiet. Everything around her blurred as she tried to take in what had just happened. The judge gave his final nod, signaling the end of the proceedings. The prosecutor, whose earlier confidence had crumbled, quickly gathered his papers and stood up. But the teenager barely noticed. Her focus was entirely on the judge, who was now shifting his attention to other matters. The realization of her victory slowly began to sink in, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to smile, though it was barely a flicker of relief. She turned to leave the courtroom, her legs feeling slightly unsteady. The moment she stepped into the hallway, a rush of emotion hit her like a wave. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edges of the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She had done it. The case that had threatened to change everything for her, the one that had made her question herself, was now over. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, she took a deep breath, letting the weight lift off her shoulders. It was as though a burden she hadn't fully realized she was carrying had been lifted. She hadn't been sure of what to expect when she entered the courtroom that day. The laughter, the mocking tone of the judge, and the prosecutor's dismissive attitude had all made it feel like an uphill battle. But now she had won. She had outsmarted them all. For the first time since the whole ordeal started, she felt free. But even as she walked down the hallway toward the exit, she couldn't quite shake the feeling that she had been through something far more important than just a legal victory. This had been about more than just proving her innocence. It had been about standing up for herself when everyone around her had doubted her. It had been about finding her voice and demanding that it be heard. As she stepped outside the courthouse, the sunlight felt warmer than usual. The sky was bright and clear, and the world felt somehow different. It wasn't just because the case had been dismissed, but because she had learned something about herself in the process. She had learned that she was capable of handling far more than she had ever thought. The fear, the self-doubt, the uncertainty, it had all been there, but she had pushed through it. She had walked into that courtroom alone and faced down a system that seemed stacked against her, and she had come out victorious. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her out of her thoughts. She pulled it out, expecting to see a text from her family or a friend asking how the trial had gone. Instead, it was a message from someone she hadn't expected to hear from her defense attorney. "You did well in there today. I didn't think you'd be able to handle it on your own, but I was wrong. You're smarter than I gave you credit for." She stared at the message for a moment, not sure how to feel. It was a compliment, but it also carried an edge of surprise, almost as though he had doubted her all along. She hadn't expected him to admit it, but then again, maybe that was the point. Everyone had underestimated her. Even the people who were supposed to be there to help had expected her to fold under pressure. But she hadn't, and that felt like the real victory. The teenager typed back a quick response. "Thank you, but I don't think I could have done it without the evidence. You were right to say I had to do it myself. I'm glad I didn't give up." She hit send, feeling a small sense of pride. She had learned that no one could fight her battles for her. At the end of the day, it was her story to tell, her truth to defend, and her voice to use. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and started walking down the street. The air felt fresh against her skin, and the weight of the world seemed just a little bit lighter. She didn't know what the future would bring, but right now, that didn't matter. Today, she had won. Today, she had proven that she was capable of more than she had ever thought possible. It wasn't long before her family found her. They had been waiting for her just outside the courthouse, pacing anxiously, their faces filled with worry and hope. When they saw her, they rushed forward, their concern quickly turning into relief. "How did it go?" her mother asked, her voice a mix of nervousness and excitement. "It's over," the teenager said, her voice soft at first. "The case is dismissed." Her mother's eyes widened, and then, just like that, the tension broke. The relief was written across her face as she pulled her daughter into a hug. "I knew you could do it," her mother whispered. Holding her close, her father stepped forward, his face breaking into a wide grin. "You did it, you really did it." She felt her heart swell with pride, but also with something deeper, a sense of gratitude for the support that her family had shown her, even when things seemed impossible. They had believed in her when she hadn't always believed in herself. That was something she would carry with her forever. As they stood there, talking and laughing together, the teenager realized that she didn't need anyone's approval anymore. She had already proved everything she needed to prove. Not to the judge, not to the prosecutor, and not to anyone else but to herself. She had shown that she could handle anything that came her way. She could stand strong in the face of adversity, and that was something no one could take away from her. The journey to this point hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, of fear, of wanting to give up. But through it all, she had learned something important about herself. She was resilient. She was capable. And no matter what the world threw at her, she would rise to the challenge. As she walked away from the courthouse with her family, the teenager couldn't help but smile. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was for sure: she was ready for whatever came next. The teenager's walk home felt different than usual. The street seemed brighter, the air fresher. It was as though the world had shifted into a new gear, and she was riding along with it. Every step was lighter, every sound a little clearer. She had walked this path countless times before, but today it felt like a new journey, one where the weight of uncertainty and fear had been lifted from her shoulders. It had been hours since the ruling, but the emotions were still raw. The adrenaline from the courtroom had faded, but the sense of accomplishment remained strong. She had expected a rush of excitement or maybe even relief, but what she felt was something deeper, something more lasting. She had faced her fears head-on, stood in a room full of people who had underestimated her, and proven that she could take control of her own story. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. She pulled it out to find a text from one of her close friends. The message was simple but packed with emotion. "You did it." "I knew you could." The teenager smiled to herself. Her friends had believed in her from the start, but their support had been quiet and steadfast, in contrast to the judgment she had faced from so many others. Their faith in her had kept her grounded when everything else felt uncertain. She texted back quickly, her thumbs flying over the keys. "Thank you. I couldn't have done it without all of you. This isn't just my win, it's ours." As she put her phone back in her pocket, she thought about the last few weeks, the weeks when it all had started. Back then, she had never imagined that she would be walking out of a courtroom with the kind of confidence she had now. The journey had been difficult, filled with moments of self-doubt, fear, and frustration. But those moments had shaped her into someone different. Someone stronger. She was no longer just the quiet teenager who followed the rules. She was someone who had learned how to fight for herself, how to stand up in the face of adversity and come out stronger. That realization made her smile as she walked. She reached the familiar street where her house stood. She noticed a small group of people gathered near the front door. They were her neighbors. Some of them she had known for years, others only in passing. She wasn't sure what they were doing there, but it was clear that they had been waiting for her. One of the neighbors waved as soon as she appeared. "Hey, we heard what happened," he called out, his voice warm with excitement. "Yeah, we're so proud of you." Another neighbor chimed in, smiling widely. The teenager's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't realized how much word had spread about the case. Her neighbors knew the basics about the trouble she had been in, the accusations against her, but none of them had known what she was truly going through. To them, she was just the quiet girl who lived down the street, the one who helped carry groceries or watered the flowers when they were out of town. They had no idea how much courage it had taken for her to stand up in court, to face down the judge and prosecutor, and to keep her head held high when everything seemed stacked against her. She walked over to the group, trying to keep her smile from getting too big. It was strange. She had never imagined her small neighborhood would be so interested in her personal life. But now, standing there, it was hard to ignore how much support was surrounding her. She realized that, even in the moments when she felt alone, there were people out there who believed in her. "We just wanted to say congratulations," one of the neighbors said. "You did something a lot of people couldn't do, fought for yourself and came out on top. We're proud of you." The teenager felt a lump rise in her throat. Her chest tightened as she realized how important these small moments were. It wasn't just about the victory in the courtroom. It was about the support, the belief, and the understanding that had come from so many people in her life, people who had quietly cheered her on. Even when they didn't know all the details. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "That means more than I can say." As she stood there, chatting with her neighbors, her parents walked up the driveway. They had been inside the house, trying to make sense of everything, but now they joined the small crowd. Beaming with pride, her mother walked over to her and wrapped her in a hug, holding her close. "I knew you were strong," she whispered. "I always knew it. I'm so proud of you." Her father smiled, ruffling her hair. "You did it. You proved them all wrong. But most importantly, you proved to yourself that you're capable of more than you ever thought." The teenager felt her heart swell with pride, but there was also something else, a sense of peace. She had been so focused on proving herself to everyone else, to the judge and the prosecutor, that she had forgotten the most important part. She had needed to prove it to herself. She had needed to see that she could face down the doubt, the pressure, and the fear, and still come out victorious. As they all walked into the house together, the teenager felt the weight of the past few weeks settle into a memory. She had done it. She had fought for herself, and she had won. It didn't matter that it had been a small case, that it hadn't been some life-changing event. What mattered was that she had learned how to stand up for herself, to hold her head high when others doubted her, and that was something she could carry with her forever. That night, as the house grew quiet and everyone settled into their evening routines, the teenager sat by her window, looking out at the starry sky. The day had been long, filled with emotions and memories she would never forget. But as the night wore on, she realized that this wasn't the end of her journey. It was just the beginning. She had learned something vital about herself in the last few weeks. She had learned that she wasn't just the person who followed the rules, who stayed quiet, who let things slide. She was someone who could fight for what was right, someone who could face adversity and come out stronger. It was a lesson she would carry with her, no matter where life took her. As she turned off the light and slipped under the covers, she felt a deep sense of calm. There was no more fear, no more uncertainty. The path ahead might still be unclear, but she was ready for whatever came next. She had faced the hardest challenge of her life, and she had come out on top. And with that knowledge, she drifted off to sleep, knowing that no matter what happened, she had proven to herself that she was capable of overcoming anything.